This is Casey Hendrickson on News Talk 95.3, Michiana's news channel.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Chicago is once again blaming us for all of their problems. For those of you in the Indiana audience, anyway. For those of you in Michigan, trust me, you got your own problems. You elected her, okay? You elected your governor. In case you didn't notice it on social media, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot has gotten into a bit of a spat with Texas Senator Ted Cruz. That reminds me, I've got to send him an interview request when I'm going to be at the Hold Their Feet to the Fire thing in D.C. later this month. The subject is guns and gang violence, something that Miss Lightfoot is finding to be largely intractable problem in the Windy City. Though some modest decreases in murders have been recorded in the past few months, rather than sticking to Twitter to hash this one out, the mayor landed herself an op-ed slot in the Washington Post this week to stake out her case against Cruz. Now, Ted Cruz had basically, he had done a back and forth with her. He was mentioning that, look, gun control doesn't work. Chicago is a prime example of that. And anti-gun activists really hate it when you bring up Chicago. And they don't have a defense of anti-gun legislation not working in any place that it works. So what they do is they look to the nearest red state they can to blame them for all of their problems. So the mayor went ahead and got this op-ed. The mayor starts out well enough, quoting one of Cruz's tweets about how she should focus more on locking up violent criminals and preventing convicts and felons from illegally obtaining firearms. For the record, in Chicago, there is a huge problem with them not prosecuting gun crimes, okay? This is a big deal there. There's a lot of issues that go into gun crime. Obviously, there's the availability of the firearms, the mentality of the individuals involved. There's a cultural element sometimes when you deal with this. There certainly is in Chicago, particularly in the South Side. And you start looking at all of these issues, and they're all separate, okay? And they've all got separate origins. They've all got separate, separate ways in which they impact this overall issue. So it's not just gun violence being the issue and what's the cause of gun violence. There's many things that go into it. And in Illinois, a lot of that is gang related. But if you look at the government in Illinois has not, for the decades that the Democrats have been in control in Illinois, they have not done anything to alleviate some of the issues that have been problems in particular neighborhoods in Chicago, which has continued to allow crime to fester and has allowed this culture of criminal activity in many of these neighborhoods to continue to increase. We're now at a point where police don't go into certain neighborhoods anymore. They actually avoid them unless there is some kind of an actual shooting. They're like no-go zones, although they're not related to religious no-go zone like we see in many places in Europe, in particular in the UK and in Sweden. It's not the same, but there are places where police just typically don't go. You've got a prosecutorial element there that just refuses to prosecute certain gun crimes. And when you look at the number of deferrals, I forget the name of the actual program. I covered this a few weeks back, but you've got, programs there where there's some leniency and some leeway in allowing individuals to not be prosecuted for certain gun crimes because you believe that they're, not really a threat, that sort of thing. And in previous years, you would see that this wasn't exercised all that much, but now it is exercised a whole lot. And as a result, people who are repeat violent criminals get released out onto the street, especially if they have gun crimes. So they're not being prosecuted in Chicago. And so if somebody has already committed a gun crime and they don't get prosecuted for said gun crime and they get turned out on the street, the likelihood that they are going to commit another gun crime is exponentially high. And this is ignored by people like the mayor of Chicago, who blame Indiana for the guns that make their way into Illinois. Now, you should know, before I tell you what she says about these firearms, that there are research studies out there that contradict what she is saying. She says that 60% of the firearms owned or used illegally recovered in Chicago come from outside of Illinois. These guns don't recognize state lines or city boundaries. Cruz said that 5 U.S. cities with the highest murder rates have had Democratic mayors for decades and aggressive gun control policies. None of them are working. He's making my case for me. As long as people can drive from Illinois to Indiana and purchase a personal arsenal without a background check, that's what she said in her article, Chicago's gun laws will always be as weak as those of the closest permissive state. Can you buy a gun in Indiana without doing a background check legally? Nope. Not unless you're breaking the law. So, and here's the thing, too. 40% of the firearms, using her numbers, which, by the way, there are research studies out there that contradict that. Her numbers, okay? So her numbers say the 60% come from outside. Now, 60% don't come from Indiana, but 60% come from outside of Illinois, okay? So 40% come from Illinois. That's almost half. That's still a significant portion of those guns. Now, let me ask you this question. It's the same question I've been asking for years as President Obama blamed Indiana for violence in Chicago. If Indiana is the problem, why don't we have the violent problem that Chicago has? If we have access to these guns and it's so easy for us to get them, why aren't we killing ourselves? Now, I know that Indianapolis has a fairly high violent crime rate, but if Indiana is the problem, why don't we have the crime that Chicago has? Especially considering we're the bastion of easy access to firearms, according to her. So it's a ludicrous argument. It's a way to scapegoat instead of taking responsibility that leadership in Chicago over the past several decades has led to an epidemic of violence there. And there has been criticism from police chiefs in Chicago that say, we're not allowed to do our job here. And when we do our job, the prosecutors don't back us. That is consistently a theme in Chicago. Tim, welcome to the program. Good afternoon.
Man, Casey, I'm so glad you brought this up. I learned something new this year, and I wanted to share it with you about Chicago.
Okay.
One of my great friends, I went to high school with him in Riley. We graduated in the 90s. And I've been deer hunting with this guy for a long time. We got talking about guns. He's from Illinois, lives near Chicago, and we were talking about background checks, etc. There was a time where he's an African-American man. He was stopped and frisked. He had a legally purchased firearm on his person. The charges were dropped because they violated his Fourth Amendment rights, not his Second Amendment right, his Fourth Amendment right. Now, this guy, he's a straight arrow, had this firearm for personal protection, but didn't go through the proper channels to get the carry permit, et cetera, at the time in Illinois. Okay. And, the law would have made this other African-American a felon for exercising his Second Amendment right had the DA or whoever was, had they chosen to actually prosecute him for the crime. But because his attorney saw that they violated his Fourth Amendment right under stop and frisk, that gun crime didn't stick. I was asked a question about this yesterday on the NRA website. Said, take a poll. Do you think all gun crimes should be prosecuted? And, I just want to say it's not a gray area. If people are allowed to exercise their constitutional right and they're walking around Chicago trying to protect themselves, should they automatically be a felon? Because that's going to disproportionately affect African Americans in Illinois. Yeah.
Well, and we've seen a lot. We've seen a lot in the black community in Chicago. These are good citizens who have said, okay, well, the police won't come into the neighborhood anymore, so we have to arm ourselves. But they've made it increasingly difficult for us to do that. And so, because they've made it difficult to exercise the Second Amendment, you're seeing people get creative, shall we say, in ways of obtaining, firearms, even though they're not felons at all.
Yeah. As we get towards this push of, everything becomes a felony these days. I mean, you can't even mow your lawn without being a felon nowadays.
It's crazy.
So, yeah, I just, I wanted to throw that out there because it's not something I had considered before when I was prosecute every gun crime. Yeah. But that was an exception I thought was pretty special.
Yeah, it's a good one. All right, Tim, I appreciate it. Thank you much. You take care.
You. Bye.
Yeah, and I haven't been, while I do believe that gun crimes need to be prosecuted, this automatic prosecution, I've talked about this with people who try to purchase firearms. People want automatic prosecution if you don't pass the background check. And I've covered way too many stories over my career of people who legitimately had no idea that they wouldn't pass the background check. There's a lot of deals that happen where you're going through the criminal justice system where you are charged with a felony, but if you honorably follow through with your sentence, when you're released, it's supposed to drop down to a gross misdemeanor, but the state never gets around to doing it. So you're supposed to not have a felony on your record. You go to apply for a background check and boom, you are popped for being a felon trying to buy a gun when in fact it's an error at the state. So yeah, I don't want to see people prosecuted for that. So there has to be some discipline when it comes to that stuff. Tim's given another example of why that might be relevant as well. We've got more coming up. News Talk 95.3, Michiana's news channel.